We will now discuss Unit Human Values, Emotivism of Ayer. Good morning, my dear friends. I am Dr. Sudhya N. Kulkarni, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. Now we are looking at certain meta-ethical theories. And in the unit on human values, the meta-ethical theories that have been spelt out or have been written about are Emotivism of Ayer, and you have Intuitionism, which we are going to look at a later date. When you talk about meta-ethical theories, I would like to explain what exactly do we understand by the term meta-ethics. Now, meta-ethics deals with issues regarding moral facts and their origin. It looks at reasons, values that motivate us into doing certain actions and at the same time prohibit us from doing others. Meta-ethics analyzes the relation between moral, psychological as well as cultural facts. Meta-ethics, on the other hand, also deals with issues regarding moral responsibility. And like I mentioned earlier, emotivism is a meta-ethical theory that we are going to look into now. Emotivism, as stated earlier, is a theory of meta-ethics. Now, what are its salient points? Well, first, moral statements according to this theory are not statements of fact. Moral statements are basically an expression of the speaker's feelings or emotions. For example, if I were to say, hey, you stole money from my purse, according to the emotivists, I am simply expressing my dislike for that action. Emotivism as a theory was expounded by Ayer in Language, Truth and Logic in the year 1936 and by C.L. Stevenson in his book Ethics and Language in 1945. The argument that was put forward by Ayer in the book Language, Truth and Logic in favor of emotivism is connected with logical positivism, an influential philosophical current which was present at the beginning of the century. Now, logical positivism is basically a name that is given to a set of philosophical ideas that were put forward by thinkers belonging to the Vienna Circle. And it was in year 1931 that A.E. Bloomberg and Herbert Feigl gave this term to the thinkers of Vienna Circle. These thinkers were also called logical empiricists, scientific empiricists, and neo-positivists. Logical positivism is basically a school of philosophy that arose in the 1920s in Austria and Germany. Among its members, we find Maurice Schlick, who is considered as the founder of the Vienna Circle, Rudolf Carnap, a prominent thinker of the Circle, Hans Hahn, Philipp Frank, Hans Reinbach, and many other distinguished thinkers. In the 1930s, many of these thinkers actually emigrated to USA, and they were instrumental in influencing the development of philosophical ideas in the United States. We will now look at the main tenets of logical positivism. If we look at it, logical positivists basically consider metaphysics as illogical and nonsensible. Now, what are the reasons that have been given by the logical positivists for holding on to such a position? Now, the reason they give is that metaphysical statements are illogical because they cannot be logically analyzed. Therefore, according to them, these statements are neither true nor false. A statement, according to them, can be proved or tested on empirical grounds only if it is making meaningful assertions. The propositions that metaphysicians or metaphysics has are devoid of significance because they do not make assertions that can be tested on empirical grounds. Therefore, according to the logical positivists, metaphysical statements are meaningless. They are neither true nor false. The logical positivists consider value-based statements again to be emotive in nature. As we cannot prove their truth or falsity, therefore even such statements according to them are meaningless. The logical positivists classify statements on the basis of their verifiability. The statements according to them must be verifiable either logically or empirically. The logical positivist in fact went on to reject the concept of transcendental ethics. This term according to them is vacuous, and transcendental ethics is an idea that was actually put forward by Plato when he talked about his theory of forms. Thus, for the logical positivist, ethical and metaphysical statements both have only an emotional appeal. As a result, the basic tenets of logical positivism pose serious problems for both metaphysics as well as ethics. Since ethical statements are emotive in nature and cannot be verified, therefore they also turn out to be neither true nor false. Now, it needs to be noted here that amongst the logical positivists, only Moritz Schlick from the earlier circle of Vienna thinkers devoted his energies to ethics. The other thinkers did not do so. For Schlick, in fact, ethical statements were simply put descriptions of the different ways in which human behavior is expressed. The logical positivist proposed the principle of verifiability, in fact, to test if a claim is cognitively meaningful, implying whether it was true or false. A claim is cognitively meaningful if and only if it is analytic or synthetic, empirically verifiable. It is essential to explain the meaning of both analytic statements as well as synthetic or empirical statements before I go on to explain the emotivism as put forward by Ayer as a theory. Analytic statements are those in which the predicate is contained in the subject. In other words, the predicate does not add anything more to the subject. For instance, all birds are bipeds, whereby the term bipeds we understand two-legged. All bachelors are unmarried men. Now, in both these examples, the term biped and unmarried are simply stating a fact which is immediately known not by any empirical verification, but rather the very nature of the term bird or bachelor signifies what exactly is intended by the use of those two terms. The terms are highlighting the subject's qualities. All birds are, for instance, two-legged, and all bachelors are single or unmarried men. Thus, analytic statements do not need empirical verification to become meaningful. The distinction between analytic and synthetic statements was first made by the renowned German philosopher Immanuel Kant in his book Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. Kant was influenced by the famous Scottish philosopher David Hume, who made of his distinction between relations of ideas and matter of fact in his inquiries. Kant expounded on this distinction of Hume and in fact mentioned that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber and classified statements into analytic and synthetic. Now, Kant classified analytic statements as those in which the predicate does not add anything to the definition. Further, the denial of the analytic statement leads to contradiction. As explained earlier, bachelors are unmarried men or all birds are bipeds are statements which, if denied, lead to contradiction. In other words, analytic statements are tautologies. Statements of logic and mathematics are in fact tautologies. Synthetic statements, on the other hand, are different from analytic statement. The predicate in the statement, for example, the earth is spherical in shape, can be verified by observation, experiment, experience. Further, the word spherical is adding something extra to the description of the planet Earth. Denial of empirical or synthetic statements does not lead to contradiction. Now we come to the principle of verifiability. The principle of verifiability, as expounded by Ayer and later by Carnap, analyzes statements according to their subject content. In other words, the claims contained in the statements must either be tautologous, like in analytic statements, or it must be empirically verifiable. Ayer uses the principle of verifiability to put forward or expound his theory of emotivism. By means of this theory, he examines and classifies metaphysical and ethical statements as meaningless or simply expressing emotions. Ayer holds that the principle of verification leaves us only with tautologies of logic and mathematics and empirically verifiable statements of natural science. He recognizes and accepts that for a statement to be empirically verifiable, some observations must be available for its verification. Ayer's famous example, there are mountains on the other side of the moon, although could not be tested during his lifetime, yet is one such example that can still be verified. After applying the principle of verifiability to moral judgments, Ayer went on to conclude that they are emotive in nature. These judgments are neither true nor false, but are simply put an expression of feelings. For example, X is good simply means something like hurrah for X. Ayer's emotivism was influenced by what is termed as Hume's fork. Language about the real world, according to David Hume, as mentioned earlier, can only be of two types, namely matters of fact and relations of ideas. The fork has two prongs. Statements are either analytic or synthetic. The logical positivist, as mentioned earlier, applied the principles of verifiability to both ethical and metaphysical statements. So sentences like God exists, God is omnipotent were rejected as meaningless because, according to them, they lacked cognitive meaning. In other words, metaphysical statements are neither true nor false, so they are empty or vacuous. For them, in fact, God was a pseudo concept. Ayer applied the same principle of verifiability to moral judgments too and declared them to be meaningless as stated earlier, they were not empirically verifiable. Ayer's view of logical positivism implies that moral judgments are cognitively meaningful if and only if they are either analytic or synthetic. Ayer was sure that moral statements are not analytic. He followed G. Moore and rejected naturalistic definitions too. For instance, good is equal to approved by society. As naturalistic definitions are not consistent with the ordinary usage of language, they fail to define an emotive term. Ayer held that moral judgments had only emotive meaning and no cognitive meaning. Thus, emotivism can also be classified as a form of non-cognitivism, the view that there are no moral truths. Now, the reasons that have been given by Ayer to hold this position are as follows. Truth claims, except for analytic ones, have to be empirically verifiable. Moral judgments cannot be done so they cannot be defined in empirical terms. Therefore, they are neither true nor false. As stated earlier, Ayer was influenced by Hume's work. According to Hume, moral statements are neither true nor false, therefore they are meaningless. Hume did, however, specify that moral statements are meaningful to the person or the individual. In other words, they are subjectively meaningful and objectively meaningless. Ayer built upon this and argued that some principle of empirical verification has to be present in order for statements to be meaningful. In Language, Truth and Logic, the reason Ayer sets out to determine whether ethical statements can be translated into statement of facts was A. Because he was targeting the utilitarians who had identified good with pleasure, the subjectivists who had equated good with a subjective feeling of approval, and the intuitionists who had referred to intuition as a moral guide. For Ayer, none of these ethical theories were in fact workable. The reason being, the intuitionist did not provide any criteria by which one could choose between intuitions, nor is good simply to be identified with a subjective feeling. Thus, if we look at Ayer's analysis of Ayer's emotivism, we find that ethical statements for him are pseudo-concepts. They appear to have factual content, but in fact do not. According to him, they are only expressing feelings, which somehow prompt us towards actions. Now, given these arguments against ethical statements, the question arises, is emotivism of Ayer a sound theory? How is it different from subjectivism? Is it an improvement over subjectivism? There are certain advantages that emotivism has over simple subjectivism. Namely, it avoids the claim that all moral judgments are true. For example, it is good to kill vagabonds has to be shown to be true by the subjectivists, as it's simply an expression, an attitude of a person. Ayer's emotivism will simply reject this statement as not true, but it is not false either. Therefore, we understand that there are problems with Ayer's emotivism. Moral judgments are difficult to categorize. Given this, we have to look at, did Ayer actually make any progress at all over simple subjectivism? Another challenge that arises is that the basic premise, statements that are true or false are either analytic or synthetic, is controversial. Can we actually go on to classify all moral statements into these two basic categories? Critics of logical positivists have pointed out that this very claim of the logical positivist is not verifiable. Not all statements are either analytic or synthetic in nature. In fact, post this criticism, many major logical positivist thinkers went on to reframe their thesis. Another objection is that not all moral statements can be translated into emotive expressions. For example, do what is good does not necessarily always translate into do what is hurrah. It is not clear how emotivism can explain the difference between moral statements and moral imperatives. Further, It is not always the case that we are expressing our emotions when we make moral statements. A common objection to emotivism is that moral arguments become impossible. Ayer was aware of this fact that ethical disagreements become challenging in emotivism. Emotivism presupposes that moral disagreements cannot be resolved by rational discourse. But for example, if I had to show someone why Gandhi was a good human being and Hitler was not, I would be using reasoned arguments to do so. If reasoned arguments are going to be used, then the implication is that moral judgments can be judged to be true or false because I am giving reasons as to why Gandhi was a good human being and Hitler was not. If reason is to play a role in ethics, then can we not say that ethical statements are neither true nor false? Therefore, it would lead to the conclusion that emotivism, as stated by Ayer, is not a workable theory. So, in order to conclude, I would just like to point out, in conclusion, we can say that the sophisticated developments of Ayer, while helping us to avoid certain difficulties of simple subjectivism, do run into certain difficulties. The most common problem emotivism has is to demonstrate how to account for comparative moral judgments. This position would presuppose that some moral judgments are correct than others. This would lead to a contradiction. In the light of these criticisms, one can state that Ayer's emotivism is not a workable theory of metaethics. In fact, if all moral judgments are equally true, as simple subjectivists state, and equally false, as theory of error points out, and neither true nor false, as emotivism states, then claiming some moral judgments are truer than others will necessarily be false. Therefore, to conclude, I can say that emotivism no doubt makes some improvement over simple subjectivism, but it has certain challenges when it comes to accepting it as a metaethical theory. Thank you.